Hi guys, welcome back to History for Sleep. 4,000 years ago, before the pyramids were even finished, some royal courts practiced rituals that linked power with love between men. Ancient tablets and tomb carvings describe pairs of male guards who lived, ate, and even slept beside their kings, sworn to protect them, not just by loyalty, but by something deeper. Some were buried together, their bond written into prayers for strength and safety. Others were remembered in myths as warriors whose closeness made them invincible. Were these just symbols of devotion or real same-sex partnerships hidden behind sacred language? The line between duty and desire was thinner than we think. Drop the time you're watching this morning midnight, doesn't matter. And if you love history that uncovers what others skip, hit subscribe, no pressure, but the next story reaches even further back in time. You stand in the half-light of a sealed chamber that hasn't breathed open air in 4,000 years, and the first thing you notice is how quiet it feels like even time itself tiptoes here. The bodies before you are not sprawled or posed in conquest, but turned face to face, nose almost touching, as if they'd been caught in a conversation that never ended. It's hard not to whisper back. Archaeologists found them near Saqqara, Egypt, the resting place of nobles and high officials who served the pharaohs of the 5th dynasty. But what startled everyone wasn't their gold or grave goods. It was the way these two men were buried together, their names entwined, their images carved as one. The stone reliefs call them Khnum and Khnumhotep, both royal manicurists and overseers of the palace. Their tombs lie side by side, merged into a single chamber, the walls covered with scenes so intimate they still unsettle Egyptologists today. You can almost picture the excavation team decades ago, brushing dust from hieroglyphs and pausing in silence, two men embracing nose-to-nose hands around each other's shoulders. Married couples were portrayed this way. Colleagues, never. And yet here they were, preserved by desert sand, an accident quietly challenging everything the textbooks had assumed about ancient love, loyalty, and what protection could mean between men. Maybe you imagine yourself as one of those archaeologists, flashlight trembling, as you realize the faces you're looking at aren't symbolic, they're deeply personal. The hieroglyphs don't call one a servant of the other, nor hint at subordination. Both carry identical titles. Both were intimates of the king. That phrase alone sounds like the start of palace gossip, doesn't it? But in the Old Kingdom, intimate had layers: advisor, confidant, sometimes protector. To be close enough to touch the pharaoh's skin was to risk your life for his. So what if two men shared not only that duty, but a bond so complete that death couldn't separate them? You wonder what it took to hold that kind of trust in a court where secrets could cost heads. Imagine daily life in that palace, where walls listened, scribes noted whispers, and jealousy brewed in bronze mirrors. Niankaknum and Khnumhotep managed to rise together, sharing titles, duties, and a final resting place. Their tomb even bears a curious symmetry: two doorways leading to the same inner chamber, as if they entered eternity from different sides, but ended up in the same embrace. The scholars have argued for decades: brothers, friends, twins, or lovers. Some insist it must be familial. Surely, they say, Egypt's moral codes would never allow such intimacy otherwise. But the carvings don't lie. They show both men in the same poses reserved for married couples, even sharing a banquet scene that mimics a husband and wife before the offering table. And if that's not enough, their names themselves fuse into one phrase, joined in life. A coincidence? Maybe. But Egyptian art rarely did coincidences. Everything carved into stone was chosen like a spell, each image a wish made immortal. You can almost feel the dry air of that tomb pressing against your lungs, carrying the scent of centuries-old limestone. There's something haunting about the fact that their story survived because they were good at their job. Royal manicurists, caretakers of the pharaoh's sacred body. Think about that hands that once tended the hands of kings. It wasn't just cosmetic. In ancient Egypt, touch was power. Those who touched the divine skin of the ruler handled not just flesh, but magic Heka, the force that bound gods and men. So the two who shared that duty shared something beyond physical proximity. It's like being a modern-day bodyguard who's also your employer's therapist, confidant, and secret keeper rolled into one. Only here the stakes were eternal. And that's what makes their resting pose so striking. If loyalty meant guarding the pharaoh's body in life, perhaps their closeness in death symbolized guarding each other's souls in the afterlife. In Egyptian belief, companionship was protection. The living protected the dead through remembrance, and the dead protected the living through intercession. To lie side by side meant their bond was meant to shield, not scandalize. Maybe that's why no curse or punishment marks their tomb, unlike others caught in palace intrigue. Their memory wasn't erased, it was cherished enough to survive millennia. You might pause here and ask yourself, why does it surprise us? Why do modern minds stumble where ancient ones might have simply nodded? The truth is, the Old Kingdom's moral codes weren't obsessed with categories of love the way later societies would be. What mattered was order mehat, the harmony that kept chaos at bay. If two souls balanced each other, perhaps that was sacred enough. Maybe that's the real secret, lying in that sand-covered chamber. Not rebellion, but equilibrium. A breeze from the desert slips into the tomb as you imagine the archaeologists sealing it again for preservation. Two men, 4,000 years gone, still holding hands beneath layers of limestone and dust. The echo of their devotion hums quietly under the hum of the generator lights, as if history itself were whispering, "See, we've been here all along." And as you turn from that chamber, blinking into daylight, the desert horizon shimmers like the edge of memory, leading you toward another question. How far did such bonds stretch beyond this tomb, beyond Egypt, into the very heartbeat of royal power itself? You follow that thought through the heat and glare of the plateau where pyramids rise like frozen prayers. Every stone here was laid by hands that belonged to someone who served, obeyed, or adored someone else. And in the palaces, beyond love and loyalty, weren't romantic notions. They were political tools. The pharaoh's survival depended not just on armies, but on the handful of people close enough to hold his secrets. In a world where kings were gods, choosing the wrong confidant could destroy a dynasty faster than drought. Now, imagine being chosen as a royal companion, one of the few allowed to eat, bathe, or even sleep near the pharaoh. Sounds glamorous, right? until you realize what came with that honor. You lived under constant watch. You were both essential and expendable. And the closer you were to the divine, the more likely you were to die for it. The bodyguards weren't just fighters, they were symbols, extensions of the ruler's divine flesh. If the pharaoh was the sun, his companions were the rays burning protective and doomed to fade when he set. Ancient Egyptian texts speak often of beloved servants and favored ones of the palace. Most of those phrases are too polite to tell the whole story. Loyalty, this absolute, demanded emotional entanglement. You didn't just protect a god king because of duty. You did it because of love of admiration so complete it blurred every other boundary. If you were lucky, that devotion was mutual. If not, you were just another name carved beneath the king's. There's a word that shows up in Old Kingdom inscriptions, Shemsu follower. It doesn't mean what it sounds like. A Shemsu wasn't a crowd member or a servant. He was one of the pharaoh's personal attendants who followed in his footsteps. They were chosen for beauty, loyalty, or both. Some scholars argue that these followers participated in rituals meant to transfer strength, even to symbolically take on the king's pain or impurity. Others note that in certain ceremonies, physical closeness, shared breath, shared embrace, was believed to pass divine essence. It sounds strange now, but think of it like a human firewall. The king's energy, too sacred, too dangerous, needed to be grounded through another body. Can you picture that scene? Torches flickering, chants echoing off limestone columns, a circle of attendants kneeling as priests mark their shoulders with oil. The pharaoh stands at the center, radiant under gold leaf, a living deity whose safety depends on the ones willing to touch the divine. In that moment, proximity equals sacrifice. Maybe that's why so many of these attendants were buried in proximity too, circling their masters even in death, sometimes even in poses echoing intimacy. And yet, beneath all that sacred language, you sense something more human pulsing through the layers of ceremony. Protection is never purely ritual, it's emotional. A bodyguard who adores his king reacts faster, fights harder, stands longer. Modern psychology calls this attachment-based loyalty. Ancient Egyptians didn't have a term for it, but they understood it as perfectly. They built entire hierarchies upon it. The strongest shield, after all, is devotion. Some historians like to compare this dynamic to modern presidential security details, those who spend years living in the shadows of power, memorizing routines, even anticipating moods. The Secret Service might not share tombs with their presidents, but they share the same code: protect the body, no matter what it costs. Imagine living like that for decades. You start to breathe in sync with the person you guard. You begin to know them better than their own family. Maybe that's what happened in the royal courts too. Except here, the line between loyalty and love wasn't so clearly drawn. And it wasn't just Egypt. Around the same centuries, records from Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley speak of royal beloveds chosen from warriors or scribes men entrusted with carrying the king's seal or tending his private quarters. Some were described in poems as brothers of the heart, others as mirrors of the soul. Scholars have long debated whether those were metaphors or memories of real relationships, but anyone who's ever stood between danger and another human knows it doesn't stay theoretical for long. In a way, these rituals of proximity oaths shared meals, shared chambers were survival systems. The pharaoh wasn't invincible. Assassination was as real then as now. So when protection became ritualized, it wasn't about muscle alone. It was about emotional fusion. If your protector loved you, you lived longer. Simple math of mortality, proven by centuries of dynasties that rose and fell, depending on who held the blade or the heart closest to the throne. You can almost hear the hum of that tension in the hieroglyphs. Every smiling figure beside a king is a mystery friend or follower, lover or shield. In a world where death came swiftly and hierarchies ruled everything, maybe the only safe way to express deep affection was to call it service. And so the art never says it directly. It just shows two figures standing two close fingers, almost touching eyes, carved to face each other forever. As the desert wind shifts outside, you realize how fragile that balance must have been. To serve a god king meant walking a line so thin that one misstep could erase your name from eternity. Yet some still chose to protect, to love, to stand within danger's reach, even when it meant being buried in its shadow. And somewhere ahead, down another corridor of time, that same paradox devotion as both weapon and wound would take on even stranger shapes, until protection itself became a kind of sacred ritual. The air thickens as you step back into the tomb of Neankunum and Khnumhotep, because this time you're not just looking at their statues, you're reading their story line by line. Hieroglyphs don't shout, they whisper. They don't tell you what to think, they invite you to look closer. Every figure, every gesture is a sentence. And here the grammar of touch says more than any text could. The two men are shown clasping hands, sharing a single offering table, their noses nearly touching the ancient Egyptian symbol of a kiss. The artist didn't leave it ambiguous. In scene after scene, their wives and children appear, yes, but pushed aside, almost ornamental. The central relationship is always between the two men. Scholars have debated this for decades. Were they brothers, colleagues, or something far more personal, hidden beneath polite translation? When the tomb was first uncovered in 1964, Egyptologists politely called them close friends. Today, more scholars are willing to say, the quiet part aloud, this looks like love. It's fascinating how that idea still unsettles people. You can almost hear the nervous laughter of early researchers shuffling papers, muttering about symbolic unity. But nothing in Egyptian art was purely symbolic. These people believed images were reality. To carve something was to make it true forever. So when two royal officials are shown in poses reserved only for married couples, you can't call that an accident. It was a declaration, coded yes, but deliberate. Picture the walls glowing by torchlight, the men hunting together, feasting, greeting each other in the same formal stance as husband and wife. There's even a relief where Khnumhotep is shown in the place normally occupied by a female partner, his arm looped gently around Neankunum's waist. In Egyptian visual language, that's a sacred inversion, a statement that balance doesn't always mean conformity. Two masculine figures could still complete each other's afterlife. You might ask, how could something so intimate survive in plain sight for 4,000 years? The answer is simple. Context protected them. In a society built on divine order, these men weren't outsiders. They were high officials, favored by the pharaoh himself. The very system that could have condemned them instead enshrined them because their devotion was reframed as sacred service. As long as their affection was tied to ritual, it wasn't rebellion, it was loyalty. Clever, isn't it? Think about it. Today we file workplace romances under HR violations in Old Kingdom Egypt. If your romance made you better at serving the divine, it might just get you your own pyramid complex. Their titles: Overseer of the Manicurists of the Palace of the King, sound small to modern ears, but touching the pharaoh's hands was like touching a god. The trust involved was enormous. Only the purest were chosen. So maybe purity wasn't about chastity. Maybe it was about devotion, so unbreakable that it transcended every other label. There's even linguistic poetry here. Nyankhnum means life belongs to Khnum, and Khnumhotep means Khnum is satisfied. When you place their names together, it reads as a phrase, life belongs to Khnum, and Khnum is satisfied. Egyptologists have long noted the double meaning their names literally complete each other. It's like two puzzle pieces carved in stone, impossible to separate without breaking both. Coincidence? Perhaps. But ancient Egyptians rarely believed in coincidence. They believed in intention. Modern visitors to the tomb often describe feeling watched, not in a spooky way, but in a protective one. The faces of Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep stare out calmly as if still guarding something sacred. Maybe that's why locals call it the Tomb of the Two Brothers, even when they don't mean it literally. It's a gentler way to name the unnameable. After all, every culture finds its own vocabulary for love that doesn't fit the mold. You can almost imagine what their daily life was like, shifting from the heat of the palace courtyard to the cool of private chambers where perfumes hung heavy and sandals clicked softly over polished limestone floors. They would have stood side by side as the pharaoh inspected offerings, their fingers brushing as they handed him the sacred oils. Maybe they never spoke a word in public beyond ritual phrases, but one glance was enough to say everything. Theirs was a world where silence could be a love language, and when the time came to build their tomb, they designed it as a mirror, two halves that joined perfectly in the middle. In death, they meet in an eternal embrace, not beneath the pharaoh, but beside each other. That's subtle rebellion disguised as devotion. Imagine commissioning your own monument to ensure that your story would never be misinterpreted, even if your descendants had to pretend otherwise. Centuries later, when archaeologists opened that tomb, they unknowingly fulfilled that wish. The two men's story became one of the most discussed cases in Egyptology, forcing scholars to ask how many others like them are still hidden under the sands. How many carvings have been misread because modern eyes weren't ready to see tenderness where they expected hierarchy. Somewhere in those questions lies the quiet triumph of Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep. They didn't write manifestos or stage revolutions. They simply loved, served, and built a resting place that made that love impossible to erase. In a civilization obsessed with eternity, that might be the most powerful kind of defiance, existing so truthfully that even time blushed and looked away. And as the torches dim, your footsteps echo toward the next chamber, where the idea of protection begins to take on a stranger, almost mystical meaning. one that blurs the border between body spirit and sacrifice. What if I told you that in the royal courts of the ancient world, love itself could be used as armor? Not the shiny kind forged from bronze, but the invisible kind, the one that binds two people so tightly that danger has to pass through one to reach the other. That's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Protection wasn't always about spears and shields, it was about connection. The ancient Egyptians had a concept called Ka, the life force, the energy that flowed between souls. The stronger the bond, the stronger the protection. Some rituals went beyond mere symbolism. In certain royal ceremonies, a chosen companion would stand in the pharaoh's place during blessings or curses. Think about that of literally absorbing the spiritual crossfire aimed at his king. This wasn't just trust, it was metaphysical intimacy. The kind of faith where one body becomes the firewall for another. You can almost picture the scene in a torch-lit temple. The air smells of myrrh and animal fat. Priests humming low, the pharaoh seated high, eyes lined in kohl, watching as his protector kneels before him. The priest raises a blade, not to harm, but to cut the air symbolically, dividing light and darkness. The companion repeats the king's vows, word for word, as though his throat could carry divine authority. The idea was simple and terrifying. If something evil sought the pharaoh, it would hit the surrogate first. Loyalty rewritten as metaphysical insurance. Now here's where it gets fascinating. These protection rites weren't isolated to Egypt. Versions appear in Sumer Babylon, even Hittite records, different languages. Same idea. Royalty needed more than guards. They needed emotional and spiritual mirrors. In some cases, these protectors shared chambers, foods, even blood, through symbolic cuts, binding oaths that made their fates indistinguishable. It's easy to see how that level of closeness could blur into affection, and how affection could evolve into what we might now call love. Of course, to the ancients, love wasn't a romantic ideal. It was a force, one that could heal, curse, or protect. The Egyptians described it as merit, a power that could bend destiny. When Nyanknum and Khnum-Hotep called each other beloved, they weren't being poetic. They were acknowledging something closer to a spell. The emotional bond itself was a shield. If that sounds dramatic, well, it was. Protection rituals could get intense. There are inscriptions describing a chosen attendant breathing in the king's essence or receiving his ka. Imagine the vulnerability of that moment. Two men standing inches apart, their breaths mingling, believing that power passed between them like a current. If you strip away the incense and myth, what's left is something deeply human, trust, so absolute that the line between you and the other person dissolves. You might laugh and think, so they had spiritual body doubles. But yes, that's exactly what it was. The pharaoh delegated risk the same way modern leaders delegate press conferences, except this delegation involved fate itself. And it wasn't always symbolic. There are recorded cases where companions volunteered to die with the ruler, believing they would continue guarding him in the afterlife. Historians used to call that fanaticism. Now, we might call it loyalty, weaponized by ritual. Even outside royal chambers, echoes of this idea survive. Have you ever noticed how in modern military culture, Soldiers talk about taking a bullet for their brothers in arms. Strip away the time gap, and you see the same principle. The body becomes a vessel for devotion. To protect someone you love is to rewrite the laws of survival. You're saying, your life counts as mine. That's what these rituals embodied. They made love functional, not decorative. Of course, ancient priests knew how to dramatize everything. Protective oaths involve burning hairlocks, mixing blood with oil, whispering vows into jars later sealed in the tomb walls. It wasn't enough to promise loyalty. You had to bind it into the world's architecture. Archaeologists have found tiny figurines buried beneath palace floors. Pairs of men carved from wax hands clasped their names inscribed together. Were they magic charms? Or something more personal? A way to keep two souls tethered forever. And yet, beneath all that mysticism, you sense the practical genius of it. The pharaoh's power was fragile. Armies could rebel. Priests could scheme. Even the gods could grow silent. But devotion, that couldn't be stolen. A king could lose everything except the man who would still step forward when arrows flew. That's not politics. That's something older than government, older than religion itself. Sometimes I wonder if the real brilliance of Egypt wasn't in its pyramids, but in how it weaponized emotion. To turn love into ritual duty, into tenderness, protection, into eternity. That's architecture of a different kind. And when you think about those two men in their tomb, you start to see why their story fits perfectly into this logic. They weren't just servants or companions. They were living embodiments of this royal principle that true protection is born not from fear, but from love. So ancient, it had to be written in stone. The temple layer shifts as if you've stepped into a dream where incense curls around the columns and everything hums with a low, hypnotic rhythm. You're no longer standing beside tombs, but inside a place where ideas were debated in whispers. What does divine love look like? And how much of it is allowed to look human? Priests of Egypt were not strangers to paradox. They preached purity, but lived surrounded by symbols of life and fertility. In the cool shadows of Karnak or Abydos, theological disputes unfolded that would make even modern philosophers rub their temples. Could a god love as humans did? Could devotion between mortals mirror the balance between deities like Isis and Osiris, or perhaps Horus and Set, whose rivalry and intimacy danced dangerously close? The priests didn't leave simple answers. They carved metaphors instead. You might see two falcons touching beaks, or twin lotus blossoms rising from the same stem. Those weren't decorative patterns. They were theology disguised as art. They taught that duality was divine sun and shadow, male and female order and chaos. Love in all its forms was the bridge between opposites. That philosophy made room for tenderness without scandal. When temple attendants or royal servants shared an emotional or spiritual bond, it could be described as ma'at keru, true of voice. The term usually marked someone's moral purity in death, but it also implied harmony between heart and action. If two people served the gods in perfect balance who could say their union wasn't sacred, picture this: the grand hall lit by flickering oil lamps' walls covered with stories of creation. A priest chants from the pyramid texts, his voice echoing off the stone. The king rises as Ra, his heart joined with his protector. The audience murmurs in awe, not realizing that the protector in the hymn may have been a living man. In religious language, intimacy often wore the mask of metaphor. When a hymn says two souls share breath, it's both poetic and literal. This duality gave Egyptian religion its resilience. It could speak of passion without naming it, allowing every generation to project its own meaning. A scribe could read those lines and think of brotherhood. A royal attendant could hear them and feel something deeper stir. That's how sacred texts survive. Censorship. They hide their truth in plain sight. You might find this strangely modern. Think of how songs today layer love and faith until you can't tell which is which. You lift me up. I surrender all lyrics that could fit either a lover or a god. Ancient Egypt mastered that ambiguity long before pop radio did. The difference: their metaphors were carved in limestone, not recorded in studios. There's also a political side to all this mysticism. The temples weren't just spiritual centers. They were the state's propaganda machines. Every myth served the throne. By allowing intimacy between men to be portrayed as divine symbolism, the priesthood cleverly reinforced loyalty. As Horus loves Ra, they might say so should the protector love his king. That wasn't blasphemy. It was good governance. Emotion became empire glue. Yet beneath the layers of incense and ideology, small hints of human reality peek through. In Deir el-Medina, a village of artisans who built royal tombs, ostraca little limestone scraps have been found with playful sketches, two men sharing wine, reclining together, exchanging gifts. Not scandalous, not secretive, just part of daily life. It seems ordinary Egyptians understood what their priests only hinted at. Affection didn't need permission from the gods. Sometimes you catch a sense of humor in these ancient records. One inscription mocks a nobleman for being closer to his companion than his wife. Another praises two soldiers whose hearts beat as one in the service of the king. Maybe the line between jest and truth was thin. But isn't that how human stories always go? We hide our confessions in laughter. What fascinates me most is how tolerant the gods seem in all this. Unlike later empires that legislated morality, Egypt's deities were too busy maintaining cosmic order to police private affection. As long as the Nile flooded, the offerings burned and the stars stayed in their paths. Ma'at, the balance of the world, was intact. You could love whom you loved as long as chaos stayed outside the temple walls. So in these incense-filled chambers, the politics of touch and the poetry of theology merged. The divine became a mirror for the human, and the human found its reflection in the divine. If you stood there long enough, you might realize that the priests didn't need to answer whether the gods approved. They had already carved the answer around you, in stone, in symbols, in silence. And outside those temples, beyond the Nile's green ribbon, another civilization was recording its own version of loyalty and intimacy, this time not in stone, but in clay. You cross eastward, following the sun, over deserts and dates palms, until the sand gives way to river mud, and the writing changes from hieroglyphs to cuneiform. Here, in Mesopotamia, land of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, The language is sharper, pressed into clay tablets with a reed stylus. But the stories those tablets tell, strangely familiar. The kings here also had companions, protectors, and favorites. They just called them something different. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving works, the bond between the warrior king Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu reads like a heartbeat echoing Neon Khnum and Khnumhoteps. You can almost see them meeting in slow motion. One wild and unshaven, born of clay and wilderness. The other polished and proud king of Uruk. Their first encounter ends in a wrestling match so fierce it shakes the city's walls, and when the dust settles, they're inseparable. Gilgamesh says, "You are my second self." Enkidu follows him into battles, dreams, and even divine punishment. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh weeps not as a ruler, but as a man broken in half. He rages at the gods, asking why love should be punished. His grief turns him into the first hero to question immortality. It's one of the oldest stories on Earth. And it starts with two men so bound together that their separation becomes myth. Historians like to argue about whether the relationship was spiritual, platonic, or romantic. But the words don't matter much when you read the tone. The text describes Gilgamesh touching Enkidu's chest, whispering, "My friend, my brother." It's affection carved in clay, and it mirrors Egypt's stone carvings in emotion, if not in material. Two civilizations, two languages, one idea. Love between men could embody loyalty, courage, and divine balance. And it wasn't just myth. Administrative tablets from the city of Mari mention beloved attendants of kings. Men granted land jewelry or burial privileges for their service. One Akkadian term, Ra-Imu, literally means the one who loves. The word shows up beside official titles, as if affection itself was a credential. In one letter, a queen mother scolds her son for neglecting his Ra-Imu, reminding him that a ruler without his beloved is a king without a heart. Try imagining that line in a modern cabinet meeting. Of course, ancient bureaucracy had a way of sanitizing affection. Where hieroglyphs showed embraces, these tablets use economics gifts of fine oil, ceremonial daggers, horses. But beneath the transactions is the same undercurrent care, devotion, perhaps even a belief that love made better leaders. A king, surrounded by those who loved him, ruled more securely than one ruled by fear. History quietly agrees. Tyrants rarely die peacefully. Even Sumer's gods seem to model this dynamic. The deity Inanna, goddess of love and war, had both male and female attendants known as Gala, who sang hymns in her temples. Many of them lived outside gender norms, performing rituals that blended masculine strength with feminine grace. When Inanna's myth speaks of her descent into the underworld, she's accompanied by a faithful servant who mourns her like a lover. The divine and the personal constantly overlap, blurring boundaries that later cultures would spend centuries trying to redraw. The Hittites picked up these threads too. Their royal oaths often required two men to share blood and breath-sealing alliances that sound as much emotional as political. Some scholars call this the ancestor of blood brotherhood, but the phrase doesn't quite capture the gravity. These weren't childhood pacts made with pinpricks. They were full-fledged ceremonies, witnessed by priests, backed by gods. Two warriors, one promise. If death comes, it must pass through me before it reaches you. You might notice how every civilization, when pushed to its limits, rediscovered the same equation. Protection equals connection. The more one man loved another, the safer the empire became. It's almost ironic. We think of ancient power as built on domination, but the foundations were often emotional. Kingdoms didn't survive on fear alone. They needed loyalty born of affection, the kind of bond that no bribe could buy. Modern psychology might call this attachment as leadership. In ancient terms, it was sacred geometry, the heart as a fortress. You can trace it through languages: Egyptian, Merut, Akkadian, Raimu Sumerian, Ki, Ag2. All mean both love and protection. The connection wasn't poetic, it was practical. Love was insurance against betrayal. There's a tablet from Lagash where a scribe describes two soldiers who slept side by side dreaming the same dream. It's small, almost throwaway, but you can feel the humanity in it. They weren't kings, weren't gods, just men trying to survive the chaos of the Bronze Age and finding comfort in the person beside them. Thousands of years later, archaeologists brush dust from their graves and find the same pairing, two skeletons' arms bent toward each other. No one writes headlines about them, but their story is the same song humming quietly through time. As you run your fingers along those cracked tablets, you realize how little has changed. Empires rise and fall, writing systems come and go, but the human habit of loving across danger remains stubbornly immortal. And somewhere beyond the rivers of Mesopotamia, in lands soon to rise into Persia, Greece, and Japan, this same ritual, this fusion of love and duty would reappear, reshaped again and again, like an echo refusing to fade. They say history is written by the victors, but love the kind that defied the rules was written in riddles. Here's the hook. Sometimes the only way to preserve truth was to disguise it as myth. So, when you start reading ancient stories about twin eagles, mirrored warriors, or brothers of one soul, you're not just reading legends. You're eavesdropping on secrets. Imagine the palace scribes bent over their clay or papyrus by lamplight, glancing over their shoulders before they wrote. Their task wasn't just to record, it was to camouflage. If affection between men was too sacred or too politically inconvenient to describe openly, they turned it into allegory. That's how myth became the world's oldest encryption software. You see it everywhere once you start looking. In Egypt, two falcons carved side by side, Horus and his companion, represent balance, but also companionship. In Sumer, twin bulls plowing a single field symbolize unity and strength. In Greece, it's Castor and Pollux, the divine twins who die for each other and become stars. In each of these tales, intimacy hides behind a metaphor. It's the ancient equivalent of speaking in code, where a story about the sky is really a story about two hearts. Sometimes the disguise was even bolder. Take the story of Achilles and Patroclus. Homer calls them companions, but the grief that Achilles displays after Patroclus' death makes political neutrality hard to believe. He refuses to eat, he weeps over the body, and he desecrates his enemy's corpse in revenge. That's not military protocol, that's personal devastation. Yet the ancient Greeks framed their bond in terms of heroic friendship. Translation: a love too powerful to name aloud, but too important to erase. The same pattern appears in Asian texts too. In early Japanese chronicles, samurai tales sometimes describe pairs of warriors who shared one heart. The phrase sounds poetic, but everyone in those courts knew what it meant. In societies obsessed with order and honor, emotional truth had to travel in disguise. Why the secrecy power mostly? Dynasties needed heirs, and heirs required the appearance of conventional family life. But people didn't stop feeling just because politics said so. So they wrote in metaphors, carved in doubles painted in mirrors. If a man couldn't say I love him, he could say we are two hawks who hunt as one. The gods would understand. You can almost picture the irony a scribe centuries ago drafting a hymn to the two hearts of Ra, knowing full well he's writing about two men he's seen at court side by side. Maybe he smiled a little as he pressed his reed into wet clay, thinking, this will survive long after their names are forgotten. And he was right. The metaphors lasted. The feelings hid safely inside them. The ancient world excelled at double meaning. Even funerary texts, the coffin, texts Book of the Dead, are riddled with duality's protector and protected twin souls guarding each other's ka. The imagery of paired figures appears so often that early archaeologists assumed it was purely symbolic. Now we know better. Statues of two men or two women were sometimes offerings from one to another, not gifts from the state. Those small sculptures, barely larger than your hand, told entire stories wordlessly. Two faces turned inward eternally in conversation. It's funny how modern scholarship sometimes plays the same censoring game. Museums relabel partners as close associates, companions, ritual pairings, as if human affection needed a bureaucratic permit to exist. Yet the people who made those artifacts never asked for permission. They just left proof. They trusted the future would eventually learn to read between the lines. And perhaps that's the quiet triumph of the mythic disguise. It allowed love to survive where law or reputation might have erased it. Like a secret code shared across millennia, it says we were here. You'll find us if you're paying attention. If you walk through the British Museum today, you'll see these pieces lined neatly under glass. A pair of statuettes from the 18th dynasty labeled servants. A relief from Lagash marked warriors a marble from Greece tagged brothers. But if you linger long enough, watch the way the figures lean toward each other. How their eyes align, you'll start to hear what the curators can't print on the placards. The old language of connection. The rhythm of twin hearts carved in stone. Maybe that's why history keeps retelling itself in echoes. The metaphors migrate, the names change, but the message remains constant. The only thing strong enough to survive censorship is love, disguised as loyalty. And it wouldn't take long for entire empires, Persian, Greek, Japanese, to start borrowing that very disguise, polishing it into their own traditions until protection rituals became a global language. The torchlight of history flickers again, and suddenly you're standing beneath the marble arches of Persia. Empires have changed, gods have changed, even alphabets have changed. But the idea stays the same. Loyalty through love, devotion through duty. What began in Egypt's tombs and Sumer's myths now re-emerges in the heart of royal courts, stretching from Persepolis to Athens to Kyoto. In Persia, the Achaemenid kings took the concept of the beloved protector and turned it into a political institution. Royal companions called bandaka were more than courtiers. They were extensions of the king's personhood. When Darius I went to battle, his favorite attendants marched within arm's reach, sharing his tent, his meals, and sometimes his punishment. Persian sources describe one such companion, Intefurnes, whose loyalty was so absolute that when he defied the king Darius, hesitated to execute him. Imagine being so close to power that even your rebellion feels personal. Greeks who visited Persia were fascinated by this dynamic. Herodotus couldn't resist writing about it, though he did so with that mix of curiosity and judgment the Greeks perfected. He described Persian nobles as those who loved their lords as themselves, not realizing he'd stumbled upon something older than either empire, the tradition of love as protection. And when those same Greeks looked inward, they saw it reflected in their own culture. Sparta, for instance, practically weaponized affection. Young soldiers were paired in mentorships called Erastes and Eromenos, a relationship historians still argue over. But strip away the academic vocabulary, and what you see is simple. The older warrior protected his younger partner in life and in battle. The younger, in turn, swore loyalty unto death. In an army of paired hearts, courage became contagious. Xenophon, the soldier philosopher, once wrote that men fight more bravely when watched by those they love. You might smile at that, because it's still true. Armies throughout time have discovered that affection makes better fighters than fear ever could. The sacred band of Thebes proved it. 300 soldiers, 150 couples, trained, disciplined, and undefeated for decades. They didn't fight for gold or country or abstract honor. They fought for each other. And when they finally fell at the Battle of Chaeronea, even Alexander the Great reportedly paused to honor their bodies, saying, "Perish any man who suspects that these men either did or suffered anything shameful." Alexander himself had Hephaestion, a companion general and confidant so close that the king called him another Alexander. When Hephaestion died, Alexander cut his hairband music and ordered divine honors in his memory. That's not just friendship, that's ritual mourning. The Macedonian Empire, like Egypt, before it had learned how to sanctify affection. To love one's protector wasn't scandal, it was strategy wrapped in sanctity. Meanwhile, far across the world, the samurai of Japan were crafting their own version of this tradition. In the Sengoku period, Shudo, the way of youths, wasn't hidden, it was celebrated. Bonds between older and younger warriors were believed to create not weakness, but discipline. Samurai chronicles describe pairs who slept under one quilt, vowing to die before seeing the other fall. The same ideals honor sacrifice protection played out beneath the paper lanterns of feudal Japan, just as they had under the gold ceilings of Thebes. Different languages, same logic. Love makes warriors loyal. Loyalty makes empires endure. Whether carved in hieroglyphs or recited in haiku, the heartbeat doesn't change. Of course, each culture rebranded it to suit its own needs. The Greeks turned affection into philosophy, calling it the highest form of virtue. The Persians turned it into hierarchy, binding men to the throne. The Japanese turned it into poetry, folding it between cherry blossoms and death oaths. But beneath every ritual, every incense offering, every clasped hand lies. That same old truth, Niang Khnum and Khnum Hotep, once carved into limestone the most sacred protection, isn't fear, it's love. It's hard not to wonder how many empires quietly depended on those unspoken bonds. How many crises were averted because one person refused to betray another. How many wars ended faster because someone stepped between a sword and their lord. We'll never have those numbers. History only records the kings. It rarely names the hearts that kept them alive. But look closely at the art, the poetry, the ruins, and you start to see a pattern. The gods might change their names, but the devotion stays. Each civilization inherits the same secret and dresses it in new robes. By the time it reaches late antiquity, companions of rulers become saints, beloved generals become martyrs, and the line between divine and human affection disappears completely. From the Nile to the Aegean to the rising sun of Kyoto, the language of loyalty evolves, but the melody is unchanged. When two men stand side by side, guarding something greater than themselves, the world calls it duty. But stone remembers it differently. It calls it love. And centuries later, when those stones resurface in museums and excavation sites, a new kind of battle begins, not between armies, but between interpretations. By the time you reach the modern age, the battlefield isn't on the sand or the marble floor. It's in museum basements and academic conferences. The soldiers are archaeologists, the weapons are footnotes, and the casualties are the truths that don't fit the syllabus. Picture it, a dusty museum storeroom, shelves lined with mislabeled fragments. Two limestone figures, clasping hands, sit under a tag that reads Associates. Nearby, a curator in sensible shoes frowns at the catalog entry and adds in neat penmanship, possible brothers. That's how history hides in plain sight through polite rewording. When Nianchchnum and Khnum Hotep's tomb was first excavated in 1964, the discovery was hailed as a masterpiece of Old Kingdom art. But the real story, the intimacy carved into those walls, made people nervous. Western Egyptologists of the 20th century weren't ready for that kind of conversation. So the official description quietly labeled the two men close colleagues, later brothers, and finally, perhaps twins. Because calling them lovers felt too modern, too messy, too human. You can almost hear the academic meetings. Let's not impose modern interpretations, someone says, tapping their pen. Another clears his throat. We must remain objective. Yet objectivity in this case meant erasure. They didn't question whether love existed, only whether they were allowed to say it out loud. Some researchers pushed back. In the 1970s, a few brave voices like Greg Reeder and Nadine Cherpian argued that the art spoke for itself. They compared the iconography, the handclasps, the positioning, the shared tomb. These weren't metaphors. They were patterns of partnership. The debate grew so heated that conferences started holding entire panels on ambiguity in Old Kingdom relationships. A polite academic phrase, meaning were they or weren't they? The irony, of course, is that the ancients themselves never wrote shame into their depictions. That came later from Victorians with rulers in one hand and translation manuals in the other. By the 19th century, museum guides were quietly rewriting the emotional lives of the past to match modern comfort zones. Statues became friends, poets became mentors, whole histories of devotion were redacted by euphemism. But history has a stubborn streak. It waits patiently for rediscovery. And in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, scholars from Egypt, Europe, and Africa began to revisit these artifacts with fresh eyes and fewer cultural blinders. They found patterns not just in Egypt, but across civilizations. Pairs of men buried together in Crete double tombs in Anatolia, even joint memorial steles in the Indus Valley. The same composition repeated like a chorus, two equals side by side, united in eternity. That's when the term same-sex companionship burials began appearing in journals, a cautious but revolutionary phrase. For the first time, academic language started to catch up with what the art had been saying all along. And yet, resistance remained. You'd think archaeology was immune to emotion, but dig deep enough, and you'll find that even scholars have hearts. Some couldn't accept that the ancients might have lived more freely than modern people do. Others feared controversy, funding cuts, or angry editorials, so the labels stayed vague, as though stone itself might blush. It's a little funny, isn't it? A civilization that built pyramids in perfect alignment with the stars didn't see a problem depicting two men touching noses. But 4,000 years later, entire committees can't agree on what that means. Progress moves slower than sand. There's a particular photo that captures this tension. It shows an Egyptian worker, one of the local dig crew, standing beside the carved relief of Neankhnum and Khnum-Hotep. The archaeologists in the picture look analytical distant, but the worker, he's smiling, not confused, not scandalized, just quietly respectful, as if recognizing something universal. Maybe that's the truest interpretation of all ordinary people. Don't overthink what love looks like. They just see it. Today, younger Egyptologists are finally saying what their predecessors couldn't. Museum exhibits are starting to include panels titled Intimacy and Identity in Ancient Egypt. New documentaries speak openly about the pair's relationship, and yet even now the captions often hedge. The two men may have shared a unique bond, may have, the longest love story in the world, still waiting for permission to be believed. But maybe that's the beauty of it. The uncertainty keeps the story alive. Every generation rediscovers it, debates it, rewrites it. The tomb of Neankhnum and Khnum-Hotep is no longer just a relic, it's a mirror. It shows us not only how the ancients lived, but how we struggle to interpret love without embarrassment. And as you imagine, standing there surrounded by scholars and sandstone, you realize that the fight for truth in history isn't about rewriting the past. It's about learning to read what's already written. Somewhere beyond the Saqqara dunes, two faces still lean toward each other in eternal stillness, unconcerned with footnotes or definitions. But you, standing centuries later, can finally whisper what they never needed to say aloud. I see you. And that whisper somehow carries across the sands into the afterlife itself, where their story has one final revelation to make. Two carved faces Yo's nearly touching, frozen in that moment, just before breath meets breath. The air around them is still, but the silence roars louder than any sermon. 4,000 years, and their stone lips haven't moved yet. Somehow you know exactly what they're saying. Because that's what endurance looks like. Not the kind written in conquests or dynasties, but the kind that hides in the spaces between two names, carved side by side. When archaeologists sealed the tomb again to protect it from humidity, they weren't burying the past. They were preserving proof. Proof that love, devotion, and duty once intertwined so seamlessly that no one thought to separate them. You can almost feel the weight of the air inside that chamber, still faintly perfumed from the oils and unguents left as offerings. The reliefs shimmer under your flashlight, banquet scenes, hunting expeditions, music, and laughter. No mourning, no warning. Just two lives built in parallel, their union so natural that no explanation was required. In their world, affection didn't need justification. It was simply part of Ma'at, the cosmic order. If you listen closely enough, you can hear how far that echo has traveled. From those Old Kingdom tombs to Mesopotamian clay from Persian battlefields, to Japanese tatami mats, civilizations kept retelling the same story. Different costumes, same rhythm. Love made sacred through protection, and protection made eternal through love. You realize something funny about time. It edits, but it never deletes. Every scholar who tried to rename them, every curator who rephrased the captions, they only added another layer of irony. Because the more people tried to make Nyanknum and Khnum-Hotep into just friends, the more undeniable their connection became. You can't erase what the stone refuses to forget. And maybe that's the truest magic of the ancient world. They didn't hide feeling behind words. They immortalized it through action. They built temples that still stand love stories, that still whisper rituals, that still make you wonder. Even in their hieroglyphs, the word for to protect and to embrace share the same root. To shield someone was to hold them close. To defend was to love. Think about that the next time someone calls history cold. It isn't. It's just patient. It waits for eyes kind enough to see it. The tomb of these two men is more than a monument. It's a time capsule of tenderness. It tells us that before empires learned to fear difference, they carved it in stone without shame. The idea that loyalty could be intimate, that affection could be honorable, that two souls could guard each other beyond death. That's not subversive. That's human. And when you step out into the Egyptian sunlight again, the world outside feels louder, harsher. Cars hum. Wind whips the sand. But your mind stays underground in that quiet room where devotion turned into art. You can't help wondering how many other stories like theirs lie, sleeping under the dunes, waiting for someone to brush off the dust and read what was always there. Maybe you even smile at the thought that those two men who once guarded the pharaoh's hands are now guarding something else, the truth about how love survives. Not through laws or monuments, but through memory, curiosity, and a bit of stubborn defiance. You look once more toward the horizon, where the pyramids cut the sky like blades of light. The sun dips low, gilding the sand in bronze. Somewhere, under that same glow, their tomb breathes in silence. Two men still stand face to face, their story unchanged by centuries of translation and denial. The world keeps shifting. Empires rise and fall. But their embrace stays the same steady, unflinching, eternal. And maybe that's the real afterlife. Not golden fields or feather-weighing judgments, but remembrance itself. To be seen, to be understood, to be remembered as you truly were. The royal protection ritual wasn't just a ceremony. It was a prayer, disguised as loyalty one, that asked the universe to keep two souls linked, no matter what the living world thought of them. So you whisper into the desert wind, not as an archaeologist or storyteller, but as a witness. Across time, I see you. You're safe now. And if the dunes could speak, they might answer the same way stone does, quietly, confidently, forever. For 4,000 years, same-sex royal protection rituals proved that love and loyalty once walked hand in hand, turning devotion itself into divine armor. From Egypt's tombs to Persia's courts, emotion was strategy, not scandal. But power always evolves. And in the next story, it passes to history's most underestimated rulers, the eunuchs who shaped empires from the shadows. You wake to the sound of a palace that never truly sleeps, the soft shuffle of sandals, the brush of silk, the faint hum of gossip carried through incense-thick corridors. But tonight, there's something stranger in the air. The most dangerous men here are not warriors, not priests, not even princes. They are the ones who cannot have heirs. The empire trusts them because it believes they have nothing left to want. That's the first lie every emperor tells himself. You picture it, a man dressed in gold-trimmed robes, walking slowly past marble pillars, every guard stepping aside. He has no wife, no sons, no family name to protect. And yet, when he speaks, generals listen, ministers bow. Even the emperor leans forward, measuring every word. His title may say servant, but his shadow rules the hall. How did we get here, where the powerless became the untouchable eunuchs, men made neutral by design, became the safest vessels for unsafe secrets? When kings feared betrayal from brothers, wives, or sons, they turned to those who could never build rival dynasties. In ancient China, they called them huanguan. In Rome, spadones. In Byzantium, eunuchos. Every empire had its own word for the same bargain: cutaway desire gain, eternal access. But this wasn't a single cruel act. It was an entire system. Boys from poor families were sold to the palace, sometimes to escape starvation, sometimes by force. Others were prisoners of war. Imagine being 10, barely tall enough to hold a sword, and someone tells you that your body will serve the emperor for life, literally. It's horrifying, yes, but also efficient. A ruler could keep you close, give you riches, even command you to whisper in his ear while plotting against his ministers. Funny how modern offices still run a little like that, isn't it? The trusted assistant who hears every secret, fixes every mess, but never quite climbs to the top. History doesn't repeat. It just keeps the same job titles. The logic was simple: remove temptation, remove risk. But anyone who's ever worked in a place with too much trust knows how quickly it turns to fear. In the Chinese Ming Dynasty, the emperor Zhu Di, better known as the Yongle Emperor, relied entirely on his eunuchs, even sending one of them, Zheng He, to lead the largest naval expedition of its time. Imagine the irony. a man forbidden from fathering a child, commanding a fleet that discovered half the known world. Yet power always asks for a price. The imperial court was a snake pit, and the eunuchs learned to slither better than anyone else. Some became librarians, guarding forbidden archives. Others became spies, recording who entered whose chamber and at what hour. When you control information, you control survival. You might think the emperors felt safe surrounded by them. But the truth, they were terrified. A eunuch could destroy a kingdom with a whisper, so walls grew thicker and the rituals stranger. The emperor's food was prepared under watch, his letters filtered through a dozen hands, and his bed guarded by those he least understood. In a way, eunuchs lived in an upside-down world. The thing that should have made them powerless loss turned into their greatest weapon. They had no sons to betray them, no wives to expose them, no estates to steal. When every other nobleman played chess with bloodlines, they played it with silence. And in palaces, where silence was currency, they became the wealthiest of all. One could say they were the world's first professional insiders. Not influencers with rings lights and microphones, but the kind who shaped wars, marriages, and successions by knowing exactly when to say nothing or anything. The historian Sima Qian wrote that the court without eunuchs was like a body without breath. He didn't mean it kindly, it was a warning. But if you stood there watching the dawn seep through palace gates, you'd feel something else to pity. Many of these men had been made into tools of power before they even knew what power was. Yet they learned to bend it, to wear robes finer than kings, to command respect through fear and service. The gate without an heir, indeed guarded by men who could never leave it. And as the drums signal the start of another court day, you see them moving again, measured calm, invisible to most eyes, but present in every decision. You begin to realize this wasn't just survival. It was strategy, perfected over centuries, carved from pain into policy, from exclusion into empire. You follow the sound of metal, a rhythmic clink, like a craftsman sharpening something he shouldn't. The air smells faintly of wine vinegar and fear. Somewhere behind a curtain, a boy is being prepared. You don't see his face. You only hear a short cry, the kind that ends too soon. This is where the story of every palace eunuch begins, not in luxury, but in a small room where ambition meets a knife. The process was brutal, yes, but it was also bureaucratic. In some empires like the Tang or Ming dynasties of China, officials recorded each transformation carefully. The boy's name, the date, the reason, and sometimes even the physician's signature, as if that made it less monstrous. In Byzantium, it was often done quietly without record. A family might send a younger son to the court because he was clever, handsome, or expendable. Sometimes all three. And in the Ottoman world, it happened in the markets of Cairo or Sudan, where boys were sold to traders who specialized in supplying the palace. The cruelty was wrapped in routine. But here's the twist: once that ritual pain was done, life could change completely. The same boy who had nothing could now live among marble silk and power. He would sleep in quarters inside the palace, eat food from the emperor's table, and be trained in reading, etiquette, accounting, or espionage. If you wanted to imagine the sharpest career ladder in history, this was it. except the first rung was agony. Still, not every eunuch rose. Most served quietly managing storerooms, cooking, cleaning, or caring for royal children. But for a rare few, the palace became a stage. Think of Zheng He, again the Chinese eunuch admiral, who commanded 7 grand voyages across the Indian Ocean between 1405 and 1433. His ships dwarfed those of Columbus. His fleets reached Africa and Arabia, and yet his power came not from conquest, but from loyalty. He was the emperor's man, in every sense trusted, because he could never start a dynasty of his own. Sometimes you wonder, would a modern government dare trust someone that much today? Probably not. But the logic back then made perfect sense. Remove bloodline, remove betrayal. What no one realized is that power doesn't need sons to reproduce it, only needs proximity. In Byzantium, eunuchs often became generals' ambassadors, even patriarchs of the church. One of the most famous Narses commanded the Byzantine army under Emperor Justinian and helped reconquer Italy in the 6th century. Chroniclers wrote that his mind was more dangerous than any sword. His enemies mocked his condition, but that didn't stop him from outmaneuvering them in battle after battle. You could say he turned silence into strategy. Meanwhile, in China, the eunuchs built an entire parallel empire inside the palace. They ran secret police forces, intercepted messages, and sometimes even overthrew ministers. Some historians believe that during the late Ming period, the real ruler wasn't the emperor, but his chief eunuch, Wei Zhongxian, a man so feared that people whispered his name like a curse. He filled temples with his statues, had officials beaten for disloyalty, and punished anyone who dared question him. All that power, born from what others considered weakness. There's something oddly modern about it, don't you think? You see people today who start with nothing, endure something terrible, and then, through sheer adaptability, end up shaping entire systems. The methods change, but the psychology doesn't. Power still rewards those who know how to survive humiliation without showing it. But life for a eunuch wasn't a straight line upward. There were dangers at every step. One wrong whisper, one jealous nobleman shift in royal favor, and a man could lose everything. Since they couldn't retreat to families or estates, their entire world existed inside palace walls. Some spent decades without stepping outside their skin. Pale from lamplight, their memories fading into incense and echoing floors. The irony, of course, is that while the empire relied on their loyalty, it also despised them. In literature, they were mocked as schemers. In folk tales, they were portrayed as unnatural. Yet kings kept them close, because kings always fear what they cannot predict. And eunuchs, by their very existence, were unpredictable humans who had been remade for someone else's comfort, yet learned to turn that remaking into power. You might feel sorry for them, but pity doesn't quite fit. They were survivors, innovators, and occasionally tyrants. Some used their influence to protect scholars and artists. Others used it to enrich themselves. Like all powerful people, they became what the system allowed them to be. So when you imagine that palace scene again, the boy, the blade, the silence, remember that history's cruelest moments sometimes built its cleverest players. They weren't saints or villains. They were simply people who learned that in an empire, the fastest way to power is often through the door nobody else dares to open. You wander deeper into the Forbidden City, that massive red labyrinth where whispers once weighed more than armies. The sun strikes the glazed tiles of the Hall of Supreme Harmony, and you can almost hear the faint rustle of silk robes sweeping over polished stone. Here, where even the Emperor's breath was measured, the eunuchs ruled everything that moved and everything that didn't. Imagine this, an empire of 100 million people, but only a few hundred were allowed to touch the Emperor's documents, handle his meals, or guard his doors. Every message passed through their hands, every schedule bent to their timing. The eunuchs were not just servants, they were the system's nervous network. If the Emperor was the heart, they were the pulse. It's easy to forget that many of them began as terrified boys. The Forbidden City trained them like machines: discipline, obedience, silence. They slept in shared barracks, learned to bow before mirrors until their spines remembered humility and memorized the labyrinthine etiquette of palace life. Each morning before dawn, a bell summoned them to duty. Late risers risked lashes. Careless ones risked exile. Yet for all that rigidity, a few learned to twist the rules until the rules bowed to them. One of those few was Liu Jin, a name that once made emperors tremble. He served the Ming dynasty's young emperor, Zhengde, a ruler more interested in wine animals and exotic costumes than governance. Liu Jin became his gatekeeper, deciding who entered the throne room and what news the emperor would ever hear. For a while, he effectively ran the country. He even created a secret intelligence unit called the Eastern Depot, a terrifying mix of police spies and executioners. You can picture it, can't you? Some trembling official arriving at the palace gates, sweating through his robes, hoping to deliver a petition only to be told, "The Emperor is resting." Of course he wasn't. Liu Jin simply didn't want that man's words to reach him. In today's world, that would be like a presidential aide deleting half your emails before the boss ever reads them. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it edits. But Liu Jin's story didn't end well. His wealth grew too large, his arrogance too public. Eventually, rival factions accused him of corruption and witchcraft, a convenient combo when you want someone gone. He was executed in 1510, reportedly after 3 days of torture. The records say his fortune, once seized, could have paid the army for 10 years. Imagine what kind of shadow economy you must build to rival an empire's budget. Still, his fall didn't break the system. It reinforced it. The emperors who followed learned that eunuchs could be both indispensable and uncontrollable. So they tried to regulate them with strict rank salaries and codes of conduct. The irony, those rules only made the ambitious ones smarter. They learned to trade influence like merchants traded silk, quietly, profitably, invisibly. And yet for every power-hungry schemer, there were hundreds of nameless eunuchs who simply served and died in obscurity. They cleaned the jade floors, tended the lanterns, fetched imperial tea, and stood guard through icy Beijing nights. Their loyalty was absolute because it had nowhere else to go. Even in their private moments, they were never truly free. The palace was their world, golden, beautiful, and inescapable. Sometimes they formed brotherhoods to survive it. They adopted each other as family, held small banquets, shared stories of the outside world they'd never see again. A few, even took in apprentices, passing down not just duties, but the subtle art of navigating palace moods. Because in a world where one frown could mean death, emotional intelligence was a survival tool. It makes you think, if someone removed every ordinary desire from your life, love, marriage, children, what would you replace it with? For many eunuchs, the answer was purpose. They became perfectionists of service. The way a candle flickered the scent of an ink stick, the timing of an imperial meal, each was treated like a sacred act. Maybe that's how they kept sanity in a world that stole their identity. When the palace gates finally closed each night, they were the last to sleep and the first to rise. Their bodies bore no heirs, but their names sometimes lived in rumors, in whispered lessons passed from servant to servant. The emperors might have called them loyal shadows, but shadows learned to move independently, and somewhere between obedience and ambition, they built a kind of ghostly power, unseen, uncelebrated, but unshakable. If you stood in that courtyard long enough, you could still feel it. The faint echo of footsteps, the hush of 1,000 silences that once decided the fate of an empire. You ever notice how the quietest person in the room always seems to know everything? That was Byzantium's secret weapon. The empire of mosaics cathedrals and backstabbing dinner parties didn't run on soldiers or saints, it ran on whispers. And the keepers of those whispers were eunuchs. Here the story takes a westward turn from China's walled silence to Constantinople's glittering noise. You can smell the incense from Hagia Sophia, hear the clang of armor mixed with chanting monks. Between those marble walls, eunuchs moved like chess pieces, neither noble nor common, neither man nor woman, yet more dangerous than both. Byzantium's emperors had a peculiar logic. They believed that a man without family could serve purely out of devotion. No heirs meant no rebellion. That idea, like most imperial logic, worked perfectly until it didn't. Meet Joseph Bringas, one of the most cunning Byzantine courtiers of the 10th century. He began as an imperial servant and rose to become the parakoimomenos, the one who sleeps beside the emperor. Not literally, mind you, but close enough to guard both his body and his secrets. When Emperor Constantine VII died, Bringas became the puppet master of his successor Romanos II. But when Romanos died young, Bringas tried to control the throne through the Dowager Empress Theophano. It worked for a while until a certain general named Nicephorus Phocas stormed Constantinople and tossed Bringas out like spoiled wine. You almost feel bad for him almost. But that's the Byzantine way today's whisperer is tomorrow's exile. And yet eunuchs like Bringas kept coming back generation after generation. They became generals, admirals, even patriarchs of the Orthodox Church. Narses, the one who reconquered Italy under Justinian, was a eunuch too. He was small, frail, mocked for his voice, but his mind was lethal. One historian described him as the most dangerous man ever denied a beard. What's funny is how Byzantine society both adored and feared them. The church considered castration unnatural, yet half the clergy depended on eunuchs to enforce doctrine. The army mocked them as weak until they saw them commanding legions. Even the emperors who relied on them wrote laws trying to limit their power laws that eunuchs often helped draft. Imagine being the office assistant who writes the rule book for how much influence assistants should have. That's Byzantine irony for you. And it wasn't just politics. Eunuchs shaped Byzantine art and culture too. They funded monasteries, managed royal treasuries, and sometimes became scholars. One eunuch named Basil Lecapenus, illegitimate son of an emperor, ruled as de facto regent for decades. He managed diplomacy, war, and taxes, all while maintaining the perfect illusion of servitude. Think about it. He couldn't sit on the throne, but everyone sitting there had to bow to him. You might wonder, how did the ordinary people view all this suspiciously? Chroniclers described eunuchs as clever but soulless, as if losing anatomy meant losing morality. Yet when famine hit or taxes rose, it was often a eunuch who coordinated relief or negotiated peace. The contradiction never ended. They were both trusted and despised, indispensable and unnatural. Let's be honest. The court of Constantinople made today's corporate politics look tame. Alliances were sealed with wine one night and broken with poison the next. A misplaced joke could exile you to Armenia. A well-timed flattery could earn you a province. Eunuchs learned to survive by mastering emotional camouflage. They smiled when they were furious, apologized when they were winning, and prayed when they were plotting. Sometimes they even became symbols of divine humility. In Byzantine theology, purity was valued above masculinity, so eunuchs were often considered closer to angels' bodies, stripped of temptation. It's strange, isn't it? The same act that made them outcasts in one sense made them sacred in another. A society that prized chastity found holiness in mutilation. If you visited Constantinople back then and attended a royal ceremony, you'd see them everywhere, leading processions, holding relics, managing the emperor's cloak. Their movements were graceful, their robes immaculate, their expressions unreadable. They weren't just servants of the empire, they were the empire's style guide. Byzantium's elegance, its polished diplomacy, its obsession with ritual, all bore their fingerprints, even when the city finally fell. In 1453, eyewitnesses wrote of palace eunuchs dying at their posts, refusing to flee. They had guarded emperors for 1,000 years. They didn't know how to protect themselves. That's loyalty at its most tragic and perhaps its most human. And so when the Ottomans marched in and turned Hagia Sophia into a mosque, they didn't just conquer a city, they inherited a profession. The Empire of Whispers simply changed language. You step through the marble arches of Topkapi Palace, where the scent of rosewater and oud floats in the air. The call to prayer echoes faintly over the Bosporus, mixing with the soft sound of rustling silks. Here under the Ottoman crescent, eunuchs found their greatest paradox, yet no longer just servants or spies, but the invisible hands that shaped the fate of sultans, concubines, and even the empire itself. Unlike in Byzantium, the Ottomans didn't hide their eunuchs in the shadows. They were central to the rhythm of palace life. The black eunuchs, most of them brought from East Africa, guarded the harem, the empire's most secret and powerful institution. The white eunuchs, often from the Balkans, handled state administration and education. Between them stood the line dividing public power and private intimacy. Imagine the harem not as a cage of pleasure, but as a political academy. Inside those perfumed chambers lived hundreds of women, wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters of the Sultan, each a potential influencer, each a potential threat. The eunuchs controlled the flow of information between them and the outside world. No letter, no rumor, no royal baby escaped without their knowledge. At the top of this hierarchy stood the Kislar Asi, the chief black eunuch. His quarters sit between the harem and the palace mosque, symbolizing his dual duty guarding both the sultan's women and his soul. The position came with unimaginable privilege, wealth, land, and direct access to the ruler. In the 17th century, one man held that post for nearly 30 years, Hachu Beshara. He was so influential that European ambassadors called him the shadow of the Sultan. Bashir Ah's story reads like a political thriller. Born in Ethiopia, enslaved as a child, castrated, and sold into Ottoman service, he rose through layers of bureaucracy with quiet brilliance. He became a patron of architecture, built mosques and schools, and used his fortune to fund scholars in Mecca and Medina. Yet he also brokered royal marriages, influenced succession, and occasionally decided who lived or died in the palace. Imagine a man who could both open the treasury and seal an execution order, all with the same signature. His power came from trust, but also from fear. The Sultan trusted that Bashir Ah had no family ambitions, no son to inherit his position, no dynasty to protect, but fear lingered in the background. If one eunuch could reach this high, what would happen if others tried? To control the harem was to control the Sultan's heart, and hearts are the most dangerous real estate in politics. Now picture a late Ottoman evening, the palace glowing in lamplight, the Sultan praying, and the eunuchs pacing the marble corridors. They moved soundlessly, carrying sealed scrolls, trays of fruit, or royal messages. To the casual visitor, they looked like background figures. But to anyone who understood the machinery of empire, these men were its gears. They also navigated contradictions. The empire called them loyal slaves, yet many owned vast estates. Religious scholars debated whether they could lead prayers or testify in court. Poets wrote about their sadness, while courtiers envied their access. They were at once revered, mocked, and essential living symbols of a system built on control, both of others and of themselves. You might say they were the ultimate bureaucrats, emotionless in appearance, calculating in practice. But that's not entirely fair. Letters from the period reveal that some wept at funerals, wrote poetry, and even developed deep friendships with royal women. After all, in a palace where everyone schemed, emotional honesty became its own kind of rebellion. The Ottoman eunuchs also changed religion itself. Bashir Ah's charitable endowments helped reshape Islamic scholarship funding, the education of generations of imams and teachers. Ironically, a man-denied lineage ended up shaping the minds of countless descendants of others. His legacy spread across continents, even as his own name faded into footnotes. In the West, travelers often misunderstood the harem system, painting it as decadent or immoral. They missed the truth that power in the Ottoman world was a balancing act, and the eunuchs were its tightrope walkers. They guarded what was forbidden, yet influenced what was public. They kept secrets no historian ever fully recovered. And when the empire began to weaken in the 19th century, they were among the last to leave the palace. Many refused to retire their lives, so bound to the walls that freedom felt like exile. One British visitor in 1908 described seeing an old eunuch weeping quietly by the harem gate after the Sultan's fall. When asked why, he said, "Because I have lost my purpose." That's the cruel poetry of power. It gives identity by taking everything else. You leave Topkapi at dusk, the sky glowing copper over the Bosporus. The minarets stretch long shadows across the city that was once the crossroads of the world. And behind those golden gates, the silence of centuries hums on, still guarded by the memory of men who were never meant to be remembered. You leave the marble palaces and travel east into the heat and dust of the Indian subcontinent. The air here is heavier, spiced with cardamom sweat and the faint rhythm of tabla drums drifting from some faraway celebration. This is not an empire of marble silence, but of color, sound, and faith woven together. And yet even here, the story of the eunuch takes another unexpected shape. In India, they were never just servants of kings. They were symbols, intermediaries between worlds. The Hijras, as they're known, form one of the oldest recognized third-gender communities in the world. You might see them even today, dressed in bright saris, clapping rhythmically, singing blessings, or sometimes curses outside a wedding or a newborn's home. What looks like performance to outsiders is actually survival through ritual. Their origins reach deep into myth. In ancient Hindu texts, there are hints of divine androgyny, the god Shiva merging with his consort Parvati into Ardhanarishvara, half male and half female, symbolizing cosmic balance. In the Mahabharata, the hero Arjuna spends a year living as a eunuch dance teacher named Brihanala, and some say that when the god Rama left his people to go into exile, only the Hijras remained at his feet, waiting in devotion. When he returned years later, he blessed them with the power to bless others. From that legend comes the belief that a Hidra's words can bring fortune or misfortune. But history, as usual, turned devotion into hierarchy. During the Mughal Empire, eunuchs were not outcasts. They were elites. They guarded royal harems, managed court finances, and sometimes served as advisors to emperors. Their Persian title, Khwaja Sara, carried dignity. Some even commanded armies or controlled provinces. In Akbar's reign, records describe eunuchs acting as political negotiators, trusted because they had no families to bribe. The Mughals, like the Byzantines before them, saw neutrality as the ultimate loyalty. Still outside palace walls, Hijras lived a very different reality. While the royal eunuchs wielded influence, the broader community existed on the margins, revered in ritual, rejected in society. They survived through performance, blessing newborns or newlyweds, and in return receiving gifts or money. The contradiction is ancient. The same culture that sees them as sacred also keeps them at arm's length. If you ever walk through an Indian market and see a group of Hijras approaching, people will part ways instantly, not out of fear of violence, but out of superstition. Their claps echo sharp and deliberate, almost ceremonial. One voice calls out a blessing, another teases, a third sings. Beneath the laughter is an old, unspoken warning: ignore them, and misfortune follows. It's an economic system wrapped in myth, a survival strategy written in sound. Yet, to dismiss them as relics of the past would be a mistake. Even under British colonial rule, Hijras continued to exist despite laws branding them as criminal tribes. Victorian morality, uncomfortable with fluid gender roles, tried to erase what Indian spirituality had long accepted. Officials closed Hydra households, seized their lands, and banned their rituals. But like rivers finding new routes after a flood, the community adapted. They survived underground through kinship and ceremony. Some historians call the Hydras the Empire's blind spot, visible everywhere, understood nowhere. Their social structure was unique, each household led by a guru who mentored younger Keela's disciples. Together, they formed tight-knit families, bound not by blood, but by survival and shared exile. And yes, many of them were castrated, but not all. Some joined voluntarily, identifying with the community's spiritual calling, rather than its physical transformation. What's remarkable is how faith gave them what politics denied. At Hindu weddings, their blessings are still sought. At births, their songs still echo. Even modern Bollywood films sometimes portray them as guardians of fate, comic relief to some prophets to others. You could call it irony, or you could call it resilience. Think about it in a world obsessed with defining gender. This community existed for millennia, outside that binary, neither fully accepted nor completely erased. The Mughal eunuchs served thrones. The Hijras served faith. Both found power in the spaces where others saw only loss. There's a strange piece to it, too. Some Hijras say they feel closer to the divine because they embody both halves of creation. God made me complete by making me incomplete, one said in an interview centuries later. It sounds like poetry, but maybe it's just truth, dressed in rhythm. And so, as night falls over Delhi or Lahore, you can still hear them voices rising from narrow streets, laughter mingling with drum beats. The same echo that once filled Mughal courts now floats above traffic horns and cell phone rings. Empires crumble, languages die, but the Hijras endure, half-forgotten, half-divine, entirely human. Rome loved control so much it even tried to control desire, and when that failed, it invented hypocrisy with marble columns. You can almost hear the senators whisper virtue for the public, indulgence for the private. And somewhere between those two worlds stood the eunuchs, half tolerated, half reviled, and wholly necessary. You walk through the marble corridors of imperial Rome, past frescoes of gods that look suspiciously human. This was a civilization that celebrated virility in statues, yet hired castrated servants to guard its secrets. It's almost comedic, the empire that preached dominance built itself on the backs of those denied it. The Romans didn't invent eunuchs, but they perfected their paperwork. By the 1st century, CE eunuchs were common in wealthy households as attendants, chamberlains, and singers. They guarded women's quarters and managed property. Their existence made sense in a society obsessed with lineage and suspicion. If you feared adultery, you hired someone incapable of it. And since power in Rome was often inherited through family, eunuchs were considered safe investments, trusted, educated, and loyal, because they had nowhere else to go. But Rome also had a complicated relationship with masculinity. To be a VR, a true man, meant dominance, control, the ability to conquer. Eunuchs, by contrast, were the empire's mirror, reflecting everything Romans feared about losing control. That's why Roman writers mocked them relentlessly. The poet Juvenal called them half-men, while others used them as metaphors for decadence and decay. It was easier to ridicule what they didn't understand. And yet, while moralists wagged their styluses, emperors quietly filled their palaces with eunuchs. Under the later Roman Empire, they became indispensable. Diocletian and Constantine both employed eunuchs as chamberlains and advisors. In fact, Constantine's own son, Constantius II, relied so heavily on his eunuch Eusebius that senators called him the Second Emperor. Behind the facade of discipline and virtue, real power often came from the soft voice behind the throne. If you think about it, the whole empire was a stage play about appearances. Senators debated morality while hosting gladiator games. Philosophers praised moderation while feasting on peacock. Eunuchs just fit the pattern. They were living contradictions, the perfect symbols of Rome's moral double life. And some of them used that irony to their advantage. Take the case of Eutropius, a Byzantine eunuch who rose through military ranks after the empire's division. He became consul in 399 CE, the first eunuch to hold such a high civil office. The historian Claudian despised him, calling him the shame of Rome, but grudgingly admitted his intelligence. Eutropius was ruthless, pragmatic, and utterly unembarrassed by what made him different. In a world built on machismo, he won by refusing to play the game. The empire's relationship with eunuchs also took a religious turn. As Christianity spread the story of the eunuch for the kingdom of heaven from the Gospel of Matthew gained traction. Some believers, taking it literally, castrated themselves to avoid temptation and act both condemned and admired. Even the early church fathers couldn't agree. Origen, one of Christianity's greatest theologians, allegedly took a knife to himself in pursuit of purity. The result was theological chaos and a new kind of power dynamic. Spiritual eunuchs now competed with physical ones for moral authority. By the time the Eastern Roman Empire became Byzantium, the role of eunuchs had shifted from taboo to institution. They were no longer just servants, but the empire's conscience mediating between earthly and divine power. The Romans had feared them. The Byzantines embraced them. It's the historical equivalent of promoting your biggest scandal to head of HR. And through it all, Rome's obsession with control never truly vanished. Even as the empire crumbled under its own contradictions, eunuchs remained as proof that power wasn't about muscle, it was about access. They had no armies, no bloodlines, no heirs yet. They could whisper a decision that altered the fate of provinces. Does that sound familiar? It should. Every era has its version of these quiet influencers, the people without thrones who somehow hold all the keys. The eunuchs were just the ancient model, operating with scrolls instead of screens. If you walked into a Roman banquet hall, you'd see them there, silent, graceful, arranging the emperor's cloak or refilling a senator's cup. The guests might pretend they were invisible, but every conversation slowed when they passed. Power recognizes power, even when it pretends not to. In the end, Rome's eunuchs became the bridge between empires. When the western half fell, many found refuge in Constantinople, carrying with them the habits of an empire that claimed to conquer the world but couldn't master itself. The marble cracked, the statues fell, but the quiet ones kept working. That's how power survives, under new names, same instincts. So as you walk out of that crumbling forum, you realize the Romans never really buried their contradictions. They exported them. Byzantium inherited their politics. The Ottomans inherited their system, and the modern world inherited their logic. Control the bodies, and you control the story. You pause on your imaginary stroll through history, the sound of sandals and silk, replaced by the scratching of quills and the shuffle of parchment. For centuries, eunuchs were the ink that never dried, always rewriting power in ways that left no fingerprints. By now, you've seen them guard emperors, lead armies, and outwit entire councils. But here's where their craft turns invisible, the art of ruling without ever sitting on the throne. In the courts of every empire, Chinese, Byzantine, Ottoman, Mughal eunuchs mastered one simple truth. You don't need a crown when you can control who wears it. Theirs was the power behind the curtain, the kind that never announces itself, but decides what everyone else will say. Imagine a royal succession crisis. An emperor dies, leaving several sons, each backed by scheming nobles. The air smells of incense and panic. In that moment, the most valuable person in the palace isn't a general or a priest. It's the eunuch who holds the seal. He alone can declare which prince receives the emperor's will, or which document mysteriously disappears overnight. And since no one can accuse him of ambition for his own bloodline, every faction trusts him just enough to be manipulated. Wei Zhongxian, the infamous Ming Dynasty eunuch, understood that perfectly. He didn't just collect power, he engineered it. By controlling imperial correspondence, he turned ministers into puppets. When rivals questioned him, he had them branded as traitors. Statues of his likeness appeared in temples, officials bowed before his name, and even the emperor feared his disfavor. To this day, Chinese historians still use his name as shorthand for corruption, but secretly they admire his cunning. You could say eunuchs invented the political soft power long before diplomats coined the term. They understood that access is stronger than authority, and information is sharper than any sword. While emperors ruled for decades, eunuchs survived dynasties. They played the long game, staying silent, while others burned themselves out with noise. Think of it like a palace version of office politics. Everyone's fighting for the boss's attention, but one person, the quiet assistant, controls the calendar, the schedule, the messages. You can mock them all you want, but they're the ones deciding who gets in the room. History's palaces worked the same way, only the stakes were kingdoms. Even in the Ottoman world, the same patterns played out. The black eunuchs, with their measured voices and watchful eyes, often manipulated the sultan's relationships inside the harem. They passed letters between concubines, decided which woman would bear the next heir, and controlled the flow of news to the throne. Their influence rippled far beyond the palace walls, shaping alliances and rebellions alike. In Byzantium, eunuchs wrote treaties that saved empires from invasion. They were the diplomats no one suspected. The negotiators no one could seduce or intimidate. When generals clashed, it was often a eunuch who mediated peace. And when peace failed, it was often because one of them quietly chose not to prevent war. That's the thing about hidden power. You never know when it's being used. Their greatest weapon wasn't the sword, but the ledger. Many eunuchs managed tax systems, oversaw censuses, and balanced royal budgets. If a rival noble offended them, a few missing entries could ruin entire estates. Their control of bureaucracy was surgical. No scandal, no bloodshed, just quiet erasure. It's almost poetic, the way empires entrusted the people they feared most with the arithmetic of survival. Sometimes they used their power for good. The eunuch Anastasios in the Byzantine court reformed corrupt taxation, saving peasants from ruin. In Ming China Zheng He's voyages weren't just about glory. They opened trade routes, brought back medical herbs, and expanded the empire's cultural horizon. For every tyrant like Wei Zhongxian, there were others who used access to protect stability. But power never comes without envy. Ministers accused eunuchs of poisoning politics, priests denounced them as abominations, and the people mocked them in plays and songs. Yet every time one fell, another rose. Why? Because rulers couldn't live without them. You can't fire the person who knows where every letter ledger and secret body is buried. It's a lesson that still echoes today. When authority is public, influence must be private. The eunuchs were the inventors of that paradox. They thrived in uncertainty, balancing on the knife's edge between servitude and command. Their neutrality became both armor and weapon. Imagine standing in one of those imperial archives, the air thick with dust and candle smoke. Scrolls and tablets lie stacked in endless rows, each one bearing decisions that shaped millions of lives. Behind a desk sits a man, dressed in modest robes, his face unreadable, his voice calm. When a messenger rushes in asking for permission, he simply nods and seals a letter. The order goes out, the empire shifts, and no one ever writes his name in the story. That was the genius of eunuchs. They didn't chase immortality through monuments. They achieved it through absence. Their fingerprints are all over history, but always in places where fingerprints fade fastest. The sound of empires collapsing isn't thunder, it's paperwork falling out of favor. When dynasties die, the marble cracks, the banners burn, and the eunuchs are always the first to be blamed. You've seen this pattern before. They rise with silence and fall with noise. It's almost a natural law of history, the scapegoat cycle. As China's Ming dynasty unraveled in the 17th century, the eunuchs, who once ruled the Forbidden City, were hunted like thieves. Wei Zhongxian, who had strutted through the palace like a god, ended up hanging himself in a roadside temple. His enemies displayed his corpse as a warning. The empire eats its shadows when the light fades. But by then, the damage was done. For decades afterward, Chinese emperors wrote laws forbidding eunuchs from holding real power, pretending the system could erase its own addiction. It never truly did. In Byzantium's final centuries, the story repeated. The eunuchs who had once commanded armies were now relics of an older order. As the Ottoman Turks tightened their siege, Constantinople's courtiers bickered over faith and politics. When the walls finally fell in 1453, many of the palace eunuchs refused to flee. Chroniclers say they died still clutching the imperial keys, symbols of loyalty in a city that no longer existed. And then came the Ottomans, who adopted the same system under a new banner. For centuries, it worked beautifully until it didn't. By the 19th century, as Europe modernized and nationalism spread, the Ottoman court began to look like an echo chamber of old rituals. The eunuchs still guarded the harem, but their world was shrinking. Western observers mocked them as fossils of tyranny, not realizing they were witnessing the final flicker of a 1,000-year institution. When the Young Turk Revolution erupted in 1908, the empire suddenly declared itself constitutional and modern. That meant no more harems, no more eunuchs. Many of the palace's longtime servants were quietly dismissed, left wandering the streets of Istanbul in ornate robes that now looked absurdly out of place. Some became beggars, others caretakers of mosques, a few even tour guides for Westerners eager to glimpse the last eunuch of the East. The title became a sad kind of spectacle. History is cruel to those who serve too faithfully. Every fallen empire rewrites its guilt by blaming the people who kept it running. Eunuchs became the perfect target, too visible to ignore, too voiceless to defend themselves. Later chroniclers painted them as conspirators, seducers of kings, or corrupt parasites. But look closer, and you'll see something else men shaped by the system's contradictions, punished for mastering its logic. It's a pattern that feels familiar, isn't it? When a company fails, the CEO blames the advisors. When a kingdom collapses, the king blames the counselors. The ones who cleaned up the mess are the first to be accused of making it. History doesn't change much, it just updates its vocabulary. The revenge of history, though, is subtle. The same rulers who outlawed eunuchs could never quite escape their influence. Even after the practice disappeared, its shadow lingered. In imperial China, the bureaucracy they refined remained the backbone of governance. In the Ottoman Empire, the charitable endowments of men like Bashir Yawa continued funding schools and mosques long after their titles vanished. Their fingerprints are still on city skylines, library foundations, even irrigation canals. Some historians argue that eunuchs represented the truest face of empire, ruthless efficiency wrapped in moral justification. They were what happened when power ran out of trust, but not out of need. They proved that loyalty, like iron, could be forged by removing what makes it human. You can almost picture one of them, old and forgotten, sitting outside a shuttered palace gate at twilight. He's watching the sun sink behind domes and sari. Bergskol, once owned by proxy. His hands tremble slightly as he smooths the edge of his robe, still perfectly pressed out of habit. Around him, the world rushes toward modernity, railways, telegraphs, revolutions, but he doesn't flinch. He's seen too many beginnings to believe in endings. Maybe that's why eunuchs linger in ghost stories and legends. They became symbols of endurance, the servants who outlived masters, the loyal who survived betrayal. Their lives challenge our favorite narrative about power, that it always belongs to the loudest, strongest, or most visible. Theirs was the power that waited, adapted, and refused to die. And when you read the last line of their history, it doesn't feel like closure. It feels like a whisper from behind a curtain. "We were here," it says. "You just weren't listening." You think the story ends when the palace doors close, but history loves a comeback. The eunuch's legacy didn't vanish with empires. It simply changed uniforms. You can still feel their echo today in hospitals, parliaments, and boardrooms, wherever the question of who controls the body meets the question of who controls power. You step into the modern world and suddenly the word eunuch feels antique, almost mythical. But look closer. Its spirit never left. Science just gave it new names. Hormone therapy, gender reassignment, medical castration for disease. All of them touch the same boundary. Ancient societies obsessed over the line between flesh and authority. The old ritual knife has become a scalpel. The priest's blessing has become a diagnosis. And still, the same question lingers: who gets to decide what a body means? When the Chinese Republic replaced the Qing dynasty in 1912, the last imperial eunuchs were quietly dismissed from the Forbidden City. Some were given pensions, others stayed behind as caretakers of the empty halls. One son, Yaoting, lived until 1996. Imagine that a man who once bowed before the Son of Heaven, living to see television jet planes and skyscrapers rising over Beijing. He spent his final years giving interviews, his voice frail but sharp, recalling how he once polished the emperor's shoes and guarded the dragon throne. "We thought it would last forever," he said, but forever ended quickly. His face lined and weary became the last living bridge between a vanished world and our own. Elsewhere, the Hijras of India continued their dance with history. After independence, the new Indian constitution recognized them not as relics, but as citizens. It took decades, but by the 21st century, they had legal status as a third gender. You can see them now, campaigning for office-running NGOs, even starring in films. Some still perform traditional blessings at weddings, others lead political movements. The duality remains the ancient sacredness reborn in modern activism. In the Middle East, the story took another turn. The Ottoman eunuchs disappeared with the fall of the empire, but their legacy in architecture and charity remains. Walk through Cairo or Istanbul, and you'll find mosques, fountains, and schools still carrying the names of Bashir Ah or Kislar Ah, men without heirs who left monuments instead of children. It's hard not to feel a certain irony. They were denied the right to create life, yet they built structures that have outlived entire dynasties. Even Western medicine, in its quest for progress, stumbled back into familiar territory. The castrati of 18th century Europe boys, castrated to preserve their soprano voices, became the modern echo of an ancient practice. Their singing filled cathedrals, their fame crossed kingdoms, and yet their bodies told the same story. Brilliance born of sacrifice. People applauded their voices, but avoided their eyes, as if afraid of seeing what power had cost. In today's world, the eunuch's shadow has simply taken new shapes. The corporate assistant who knows more than the CEO, the political fixer who never runs for office, the whistleblower who exposes a king but owns no throne. These are the modern versions of palace eunuchs. Their tools are emails instead of scrolls, spreadsheets instead of seals, but their power comes from the same place: proximity to truth without ownership of it. History never lets go of a good pattern. It just repackages it for new audiences. We still live in systems built on control of people, bodies, narratives. Whether it's ancient China, regulating court servants, or modern governments legislating identity, the logic hasn't changed. The question is never just who rules, but who is allowed to exist on their own terms. If you stand in the middle of a city today, say Delhi, Istanbul, or Rome, and close your eyes, you can almost hear the echo of their footsteps. The eunuchs who once guarded emperors now guard memory itself. They remind us that history isn't only written by victors, but by those who endured without recognition. Their absence became presence. Their silence became testimony. Perhaps that's why their story still unsettles